This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi guys, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silenced them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 35, Jacob Landin, Part 1. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you the story of a beautiful, happy 9-month-old boy bursting with life and personality whose death from blunt force trauma to the head has gone unpunished for over 33 years. Despite investigators zeroing in on a single suspect, the case, which over the years saw a periodic resurgence in police interest, has gone officially unsolved, and the man believed to have caused Jacob's death has gone unpunished. This will be the first of 2 episodes covering Jacob's story. For Part 2, I had the honor of speaking with Jacob's older brother, Eric Carter-Landin. Eric, who was 6 at the time, was initially blamed for causing Jacob's death, and he has channeled his traumatic childhood experiences and the loss of his beloved brother into his own true crime podcast, True Consequences. You'll hear my interview with Eric in the next episode. This is Part 1 of the infuriating story of Jacob Landin. My sources for this episode are the official case file, True Consequences podcast, Eric Carter-Landin, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, laurarichards.co.uk, Healthline, and cdc.gov. Before I jump into Jacob's story, please enjoy this promo for Eric's podcast, True Consequences.
Hey everybody, this is Eric Carter-Landin, the host and producer of True Consequences podcast. True Consequences is a true crime and mystery podcast with stories based in New Mexico and the American Desert Southwest. I started this show to bring light to cases that need to be solved in my state. You see, my brother was murdered 33 years ago, and his murderer still walks free. So I cover cases with an empathetic lens, because I understand what it's like to seek justice for a family member. I hope you'll give True Consequences a chance. You can find me wherever you listen to podcasts.
I want to give a huge thanks to Eric for bringing Jacob's case to my attention. Even though it's been 33 years, Jacob Landin deserves to be remembered. And you guys know my top priority with every story I cover is keeping the child's memory alive. If he was here today, Jacob would be 34. Instead, he's forever frozen at the age of 9 months in the minds of those who love him. He never got to experience the joy of his first birthday party, let alone making friends, going to school, dating, finding a career, getting married, or having kids of his own. He gained his wings in 1987, but we can never let this precious baby boy be forgotten. Like many of the cases I cover, this case involves domestic abuse perpetrated by someone whose behavior exemplifies narcissism or even psychopathy. I feel very strongly that there needs to be more awareness about these disordered personalities and the trauma they impart on romantic partners and children in their lives. Our young people need to be educated about the signs of narcissism as they enter the complicated world of dating and relationships. I've seen it too many times. A young woman is swept off her feet by a man who says and does all the right things and treats her like a queen, only to end up beaten down, both figuratively and sometimes literally. Any children born to that union or brought into it from previous relationships will inevitably suffer untold trauma, and they often learn the same disordered behaviors as self-preservation mechanisms. From personal experience, I can tell you that living with someone like this literally changes your brain and your way of thinking. You become a different person. You question your choices, your opinions, your interests, your loved ones, and even and especially your sanity. It is incredibly damaging to a person. These relationships all too often end in some kind of tragedy, such as the death of a woman or child, or even the annihilation of an entire family. Those who survive these circumstances are forever changed, including and especially children who've spent their formative years in these abusive, mind-bending environments. One of the hardest things for survivors of narcissistic abuse to overcome is the abuser's public persona, which is almost always charming, friendly, likable, and well-respected in their communities. Most people who know him could never imagine that this great guy, a pillar of his community, could be a completely different person behind closed doors, let alone mentally, physically, or sexually abusive to those closest to him. It's one of the biggest reasons the abused stay in such situations, because they know no one will believe them if they tell. Laura Richards is an international expert on domestic violence, stalking, sexual violence, homicide, and risk assessment, former New Scotland Yard violent crime analyst, co-host of the essential true crime podcast Real Crime Profile, and one of my personal heroes, who I credit with giving me the knowledge and tools I needed to escape my own abusive nightmare. Follow Laura on Twitter at LauraRichards99. She has worked tirelessly to reform domestic violence laws in the UK as well as Australia and the US. According to Laura, 4 women are murdered every single day in the US by a current or former male romantic partner. Let me repeat that because it bears repeating. 4 American women every day are murdered by a man they once loved and trusted. To make that statistic even more horrifying, according to childhelp.org, in the United States, on average, 4 to 7 children die every day from child abuse and neglect. I can't tell you how many times I've told someone about my blog or my podcast and heard the response, "Sorry, but I can't handle hearing stories about children." I think my readers and listeners understand that no matter how difficult these stories are to read or hear, we all need to know about them. Burying our heads in the sand does absolutely nothing about the problem. That's why, despite the emotional and mental toll these stories take on me, the pushback and criticism I receive, and the financial cost and all the other challenges I face with Suffer the Little Children blog and the podcast, I will not stop telling these kids' stories. I will not stop trying to raise awareness of the horrific things some parents and caretakers do to the children they're supposed to protect. I will not stop trying to force this conversation to happen because abused children everywhere deserve and need our attention. Now let's talk about Jacob. Jacob Jeremiah Landin was born on July 1st, 1986 in Hidalgo, Texas, to Brenda and Jean Landin. Jacob was a big baby, weighing 10 pounds at birth, and he was utterly beautiful with dark brown hair and brown eyes. His older brother, 6-year-old Eric, said he had prayed for a brother and thought of Jacob as his own little miracle. Earlier this year, Eric interviewed his mom, Brenda, on his own true crime podcast, True Consequences, where they talked about Jacob's personality.
I just remember he was funny and he liked to laugh and he liked to pull drawers and make all the silverware fly out. And he was just a silly boy. He was really smart. Like, for being a baby. Yeah. He was so smart. It was, like, ridiculous how smart he was.
I remember, he used to take the swing, and whenever it would swing forward, he would grab the front legs of the baby swing and, throw the whole thing backwards and just lay there and laugh.
Try to flip it over.
And he'd be like, his little laugh.
Yeah, his laugh was amazing. It brought me joy just to hear it.
He was so happy.
He was a happy little baby. Well, big baby.
Yeah, he was big.
He was big. He was 10 pounds. Huge for me.
I remember right before you got pregnant, and I told you, "Mom, I'm going to have a brother."
Yeah.
And you didn't believe me.
Mm-mm. I thought it was going to be a girl, and it was a boy. Sure enough, you were right. He was really lovable.
I just remember I wanted him so bad. I wanted a brother so bad. I was so desperate.
Yeah, he would dance to the music and hit the stereo with his hand and the walker, and he would be moving his butt.
I remember that.
Oh, we'd go to McDonald's, and I wouldn't ask him what he wanted. He would scream. Even though he couldn't talk, he would scream at me because I didn't get his order. It was hilarious.
Brenda and Jean's marriage was less than ideal, and toward the end of 1986, Brenda packed up her 2 boys and moved them from Texas to Brenda's hometown of Socorro, New Mexico, to be closer to her family. Socorro is a city of a little more than 8,000 people, about 74 miles south of Albuquerque. Jean's best friend also lived in Socorro, and as soon as Brenda and her boys arrived in town, this man immediately started planting seeds of doubt in Brenda's mind about her husband's loyalty and faithfulness to her. Now, this man is going to play a large part in this story for reasons that will soon become apparent, but for legal reasons, I won't be using his name in this episode. Instead, I'll refer to him as the suspect. You see where this is headed. Before long, the rift between Jean and Brenda became a chasm, and they ultimately divorced. Conveniently, the suspect also broke up with his wife around the same time. As Brenda told Eric in her podcast interview, the suspect methodically set about weaseling his way into her life. Just like a classic narcissist or psychopath, either or both of which may certainly apply in this case, the suspect ingratiated himself to Brenda, saying everything she wanted to hear and treating her and her kids like gold. In the context of someone with narcissistic traits, this process is known as love bombing, and it's the way these toxic people are able to manipulate a new relationship with a susceptible victim to move extremely quickly. Brenda, who had felt mistreated and underappreciated for years, was unfortunately the perfect victim. In late December of 1986 or early January of 1987, Brenda and the suspect, along with Eric and Jacob, moved in together, settling in a trailer in a dusty mobile home park on Fatima Road in Socorro. The suspect was employed as a maintenance worker for the county of Socorro, and Brenda had taken a job as a checker or cashier at the local supermart. Soon after the family moved in together, Jacob's behavior started to change. While he was always an independent, fearless baby, he suddenly became clingy and didn't want to let go of Brenda, especially when the suspect was around. He was terrified of being held high in the air and of rough play. Brenda asked the suspect if he was playing rough with Jacob, which he denied. Then, in early March, Jacob started turning up with injuries whenever the suspect was alone with the boys. When Brenda discovered an abrasion on Jacob's ear, she took him to see Dr. Dan Blodgett, who told her the injury wasn't serious. The suspect again used his manipulative powers on Brenda, suggesting to her that her 6-year-old son, Eric, was jealous of the baby. Eric doesn't remember being the least bit jealous of Jacob, the baby brother he had prayed for and doted on, other than recalling he thought at one point Jacob had a prettier name than he did. Brenda seemed to believe the suspect's stories, remembering that when Jacob was first born, Eric would shake the crib to wake him. After the suspect drilled Eric about what happened and told him repeatedly not to lie, which now appears to be obvious coercion of the little boy who only wanted to please people, Eric ultimately admitted that when Jacob was crying, he took the baby out of the crib and accidentally dropped him before putting him back in. Think about how small a 6-year-old is and how tall the sides of a crib are. I can't think of any logical way Eric, who was tiny as a child, could have hauled his brother, who he and Brenda have described as huge, over the side of a crib, let alone lifting him high enough to put him back in. 2 weeks after Jacob's minor ear injury, Brenda's mother, who usually watched the baby while her daughter was at work, noticed a large, soft lump on Jacob's head. Brenda took him back to Dr. Blodgett, who said Jacob had received a blow to the head, and sent them to the hospital. On March 15, 1987, Jacob underwent surgery to drain a subdural hematoma, which necessitates holes being drilled in the skull, the dura mater, or tough, leathery membrane protecting the brain, being peeled back, and sometimes a piece of the skull being temporarily removed to suction the blood from the cranial cavity. Jacob remained hospitalized until March 17th when he returned home, Eric remembers, with his head bandaged, wearing a styrofoam helmet. The suspect again interrogated Eric, who admitted to Brenda that he kicked Jacob in the head, but he didn't think he kicked him very hard and insisted he was only playing. At a loss about what to do, Brenda called Eric's dad, Gene, who was by then living in Indio, California, and asked him to take custody of Eric for a while, explaining that she thought Eric might be acting this way because he wasn't getting enough attention. Eric went to stay with his father in California on March 18, 1987. Around the same time as the initial head injury, a state social worker named Sue Holland visited the family's home to talk to Brenda about Jacob's injuries. While they were talking, the suspect entered the trailer, demanding to know who the social worker was before commanding her to leave. The woman later described the suspect's demeanor as belligerent. It was later discovered that a phone call from a neighbor had triggered the social services visit. A neighbor told police they had overheard Jacob screaming inside the trailer and called to report that they thought Brenda's boyfriend was hurting him. The worst, however, was yet to come. At around 10:30 in the morning on Thursday, April 9, 1987, Brenda dropped Jacob off at her mother's home as she usually did when she went to work. After work, she and the suspect planned to look at a trailer, but because it did not have electricity, they had to see it before dark, so her mother would drop Jacob off at home later to save Brenda a trip across town. When Brenda last saw Jacob, he was playing happily. Later that day, her mother called her at work and said she wanted to go to church, so Brenda told her to drop Jacob off at home a little earlier than planned, for the suspect to watch him. She was uneasy about the idea, but she reasoned she would get off work in about an hour and a half. What could go wrong? When his grandmother dropped him off at home at about 6 p.m., Jacob was in good spirits and seemed healthy and happy. About an hour later, the suspect burst into the supermart in a panic, telling Brenda that her 9-month-old son had fallen off the couch, wasn't breathing, and was in an ambulance on his way to the hospital. Brenda literally dropped everything, leaving her customer mid-checkout at the register, and rushed to the hospital in Socorro, where her parents were already waiting. About seeing her son in the hospital upon her arrival, Brenda had this to say.
I got to the ER, and my mom and dad were there. I don't even know how they got there or what happened. And Jacob was in the room. And I walked in, and I touched my baby on his chest. And he took a big, deep breath. I kid you, Mama was there with him.
Jacob's usual physician, Dr. Blodgett, saw the baby in the hospital in Socorro. Later that evening, he spoke with Officer William McNeil of the Socorro Police Department, telling the officer he treated Jacob in the emergency room at about 7:10 p.m. When Jacob arrived by ambulance, he wasn't breathing, his lungs were full of fluid, his pupils were dilated, and his body was limp. Although his symptoms were consistent to those resulting from a blow to the head and either an injury or an infection inside the skull, there was no external sign of a head injury, so Jacob was sent for an X-ray. When Dr. Blodgett spoke to Jacob's family, the suspect told him that while babysitting for Jacob, he had left the baby alone for a period of time, and when he checked on him, Jacob was unresponsive and not breathing. Notice how that story is a little different from the one he told Brenda when he rushed into the supermart to tell her Jacob had fallen off the couch. Altering his story would become a regular occurrence, so keep that in mind. Dr. Blodgett also told Officer McNeil he had treated Jacob about 4 weeks earlier for an arm injury of unknown origin. After his X-ray revealed serious head trauma, Jacob was taken via lifeguard helicopter air ambulance to the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque. At 10:40 p.m., Agent Sue DeWalt of the New Mexico State Police Criminal Investigation Section was notified that a 9-month-old baby was brought into the university hospital suffering from a blow to the head and was a suspected victim of child abuse. Agent DeWalt immediately went to the hospital, where she spoke with hospital social worker Kristen Chapin and evening administrator Susan Green, who told her Jacob had come in by helicopter with a massive cerebral fracture. An examination revealed indications of other older injuries, including a previous head injury and a broken rib, so they believed he may have been abused. At 11:38 p.m., Agent DeWalt interviewed Brenda Landin, who told her she didn't know what happened, but she didn't think the suspect had hurt Jacob. He seemed to take good care of the baby whenever she was around. He had visitation rights with his own 2 young kids, and he seemed like a good father. She told the agent that since Jacob's head injury and subsequent surgery in March, he hadn't felt well and had been fussy. On the evening of April 6th, she said, he had a fever. When she took him to Dr. Blodgett, they discovered Jacob suffered from an ear infection and tonsillitis, for which he was prescribed medication. As far as she knew, Brenda said, Jacob had no broken bones. She had received a visit from social services after his previous head injury, but she had heard nothing after Sue Holland's initial visit. Just before midnight, Agent DeWalt interviewed the suspect. He told her that he and Brenda had plans to look at a trailer that evening after she got off work at 7:30, but because the trailer didn't have electricity, they had to look at it before dark. To save time, Brenda had her mother bring Jacob home at around 6 o'clock so she wouldn't have to drive across town to pick him up, wasting precious daylight. When Brenda's mother dropped Jacob off at around 6 o'clock, the suspect said, he seemed to be feeling all right, so the suspect put the baby in his walker and gave him a teething cookie and a bottle to occupy him, while the suspect lay on the floor nearby, dubbing some cassette tapes for his brother. For anyone born after, say, 1990, cassette tapes are those small rectangular plastic things with little reels inside of brown tape. Dubbing cassettes means copying music or other content from cassette tape to cassette tape, which was how we made mixtapes back in the day, probably the earliest version of a playlist. We could record on both sides of the tape by turning the tape backwards inside the tape player. While the suspect lay on the floor dubbing cassettes, Jacob was scooting around the living room floor in his walker. One of the wheels kept getting stuck on the box containing his tapes, so the suspect said he repeatedly moved Jacob away. Since Jacob really seemed to want to play with those tapes, the suspect took the baby out of his walker, gave him a couple old tapes to play with, handed him his teething cookie and his bottle, and put him on the floor behind him as he lay there with his head propped up by one of his hands. Before long, the suspect told Agent DeWalt Jacob became fussy, which usually meant he was sleepy. He picked Jacob up and carried him toward the bedroom, but at that point the tape clicked, indicating it had reached the end of one side. The suspect said he placed Jacob on the couch and went to change the tape, but while his back was turned, he heard Jacob make an unspecified noise, and when he turned around, he saw the baby lying on the floor sideways, between the couch and the coffee table, which he estimated was 6 to 8 inches from the couch. He told the agent he didn't know if Jacob had hit his head on the coffee table. When he picked Jacob up, he said there was a yellowish fluid coming from his mouth and nose, which it has since been surmised was either vomit or cerebrospinal fluid. He turned Jacob over and patted his back to clear his mouth. When he turned Jacob over again, he said, the baby's eyes had rolled back into his head. Because they didn't have a phone in the house, the suspect took Jacob and ran to the neighbor's house so they could call the rescue unit. At that point, Jacob was still vomiting, but the suspect said he placed Jacob on the floor, tried to clear the baby's throat, and administered mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The neighbor also attempted to revive the baby with no success. When the rescue unit arrived, the suspect went to the supermarket to tell Brenda what had happened. When questioned about Jacob's previous injuries, the suspect said he believed they had been caused by Eric, who, he said, Brenda's sister had warned him to watch around the baby because Eric was mean to Jacob. The first injury, he said, occurred in early March when his 2 children were visiting. Brenda wasn't home, so he was also watching Jacob and Eric. When he took his kids home, he left Brenda's kids home alone. The next day, he said, Brenda noticed Jacob had a skinned ear, and she later got Eric to admit he took the baby out of the crib and dropped him. 2 weeks later, the suspect said, Jacob was fussy on a Saturday night, so Brenda gave him some medication, and he went back to sleep. On Sunday morning, Brenda's mother pointed out a soft spot and a knot on Jacob's head. The doctor told Brenda it was caused by a blow to the head, and Jacob was hospitalized for a couple of days. Eric, he said, initially insisted he hadn't hurt Jacob, but when Brenda told him he wouldn't be in trouble if he told the truth, Eric admitted he kicked Jacob because the baby was pulling his hair, and his dad had taught him that when someone hurts you, you hurt them back. After that, the suspect said, Brenda sent Eric to live with his father in California. Immediately after interviewing the suspect, at 12:47 a.m. on April 10th, Agent DeWalt interviewed Brenda's mother, who told the agent that Jacob had been sick for about 2 weeks with his ear infection, tonsillitis, and an allergic reaction to the medication he'd been given. She said he often threw up when laid down. By that morning, though, he seemed to be feeling better, and he even ate for the first time in 3 or 4 days. She explained about dropping Jacob off at home to save Brenda a trip across town, and then she gave Agent DeWalt details about Eric's jealousy of his baby brother. For the first 3 months after Jacob was born, Brenda and the boys lived with her mother, who saw that every time Eric walked past the baby, she said, he would hit or kick him. Once, she said, Eric commented that Jacob had a pretty name while he had an ugly one. After Brenda and the boys moved in with the suspect, she said she was diligent about checking the baby for injuries because she had heard a lot of stories about boyfriends abusing children. Once, she said, Eric was eating sunflower seeds and Brenda told him to be careful the baby didn't get them and choke on them. Shortly afterward, they found a handful of seeds in Jacob's walker and another in his crib. Another time, Eric was playing with some toilet paper. Brenda told him to keep it away from Jacob, and his grandma told the agent they later found wads of toilet paper in Jacob's crib, and the baby also had it in his mouth. After concluding her interviews with Jacob's family, Agent DeWalt met again with the hospital administrator and signed a police hold, placing Jacob into temporary protective custody, which meant he could not be returned home until the investigation concluded. At 3:58 the same morning, Agent DeWalt received a phone call letting her know that Jacob Landin had died during surgery at 3:34 a.m. Dr. Benny McWilliams was the pediatric physician who treated Jacob when he arrived at the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque on the evening of April 9th. He was later interviewed by both Agent DeWalt of the State Police and Detective Apodaca of the City Police. Dr. McWilliams rushed to the hospital on the evening of April 9th when he received word that Jacob was on his way via air ambulance. By the time the doctor arrived, Jacob was already in the ER. Dr. McWilliams examined the baby, who was in a stage of coma and had suffered a significant brain injury. Upon examination of Jacob, Dr. McWilliams didn't find any obvious bruises or trauma, but he could feel a skull fracture at the back of Jacob's head, and he saw the healed scar from Jacob's previous head injury. Jacob was stabilized in the ER and taken for a CT scan, accompanied by neurosurgery resident Dr. Joe Garcia, because the neurosurgeon on call, Dr. Eric Marchand, hadn't arrived yet. They were worried that Jacob's head injury could have caused bleeding in his cranial vault. During the CT scan, they noted the skull fracture that had been seen in both the physical exam and the X-ray taken in Socorro. After the CT scan, Jacob was taken to the intensive care unit. By that time, Dr. Marchand had arrived, and after examining and then further stabilizing Jacob, Dr. Marchand decided to take him to the operating room and place a catheter in the area where fluid was collecting inside Jacob's skull to measure his intracranial pressure. Because the doctors hadn't yet spoken with the family, they signed off on the emergency operation together. After Jacob was taken into surgery in the early hours of the morning, Dr. McWilliams lay down to sleep. Around 3:45 a.m., Dr. McWilliams was awakened by a call telling him Jacob had died. Dr. Marchand told him that Jacob became unstable during surgery and they were unable to stabilize or revive him. Now they were faced with the heartbreaking task of notifying the family. Dr. McWilliams and Dr. Marchand, along with Dr. Mark Packer, Dr. Graff, the pediatric resident on call, and the pediatric intern on call, all went to the parents' waiting room, where they found Brenda, her mother, the suspect, and another woman waiting. When Dr. Marchand broke the news of Jacob's death, Brenda became hysterical and ran from the room. When she composed herself enough to return, Dr. McWilliams spoke with her and the suspect, explaining that when Jacob arrived at the hospital, he was very sick and near death, and they were unable to save him. Brenda had to leave the room again. Dr. McWilliams continued speaking with the suspect, who seemed extremely nervous, and told Dr. McWilliams that this was going to make him look real bad. The suspect told Dr. McWilliams he'd never hit Jacob, and Dr. McWilliams replied that in his opinion, Jacob's injuries could not have been sustained during a fall from a couch that was no more than 2.5 feet high. The suspect repeated that he never hit the baby. When the doctor asked if anyone had hit Jacob, the suspect said the baby hadn't been hit at all that day, which prompted the doctor to ask for clarification. The suspect said he was referring to Jacob being kicked in the head a month ago, and for a third time, said he never hit Jacob. When repeating his story about Jacob falling off the couch, the suspect told Dr. McWilliams that he was playing the stereo very loud when he heard some gasping noises, and when he turned around, he saw Jacob on the floor between the couch and the coffee table. Dr. McWilliams told police that the suspect seemed more worried about being blamed for Jacob's death than the average person he has dealt with, and he didn't have a good feeling about the suspect's level of concern for himself as opposed to his concern about Jacob. On the morning of Jacob's death, Agent DeWalt spoke with Sue Holland of the New Mexico Social Services Division, the social worker who had visited Brenda at home after Jacob's initial head injury. The reason for her visit, Ms. Holland told Agent DeWalt, was because she had received an anonymous complaint from a neighbor saying Brenda's boyfriend was hitting the baby. The same morning, Agent DeWalt spoke with Detective Pat Apodaca of the Socorro Police Department, agreeing that he would handle any investigation that needed to be done in town, while DeWalt would take care of the Albuquerque legwork, including a scheduled interview with Jacob Landin, Jacob's father, who was flying in shortly. Accompanied by Brenda, Agent DeWalt picked up Jean and Eric at the Albuquerque International Airport just before noon on April 10th. On their ride back to the state police office, Eric was crying as he said something unintelligible to his mother. Agent DeWalt overheard Brenda reassure Eric that it wasn't his fault, that Jacob's stitches had already healed, and that they did not contribute to his brother's death. How heartbreaking that 6-year-old Eric already blamed himself. When they arrived at the state police headquarters in Albuquerque, Agent DeWalt sat down alone with Jean, who told her about Eric coming to live with him because, he said, Brenda was on the verge of a breakdown over Eric supposedly injuring the baby. Jean said Eric felt tremendous guilt over Jacob's death, saying that when Jacob pulled his hair, he didn't think he hit Jacob hard enough to hurt him, and he was sorry. Eric had told Jean that morning that he knew what happened to his baby brother. He hit Jacob on the head, Jacob had surgery, and then Jacob fell off the couch and died. He said if he hadn't hit Jacob in the first place, Jacob wouldn't have needed surgery and wouldn't have died. Jean also shared with Agent DeWalt that after the incident in which Eric took the blame for taking Jacob out of the crib and dropping him when the suspect left the boys home alone, the suspect's wife actually called Jean and told him to file a child abuse complaint. Jean hadn't, and since he took physical custody of Eric shortly thereafter, he thought the problem had been resolved. With Jean's permission, Agent DeWalt then interviewed Eric, who, when asked, told her the suspect never hit him, but he did say that if Eric ever lied again, he would hit him with a belt. When the agent questioned Eric about Jacob's earlier head injury, the little boy became very upset and insisted he didn't hurt Jacob. She asked who did, and Eric said he didn't know. When asked, he told her he hadn't been threatened by anyone to confess to kicking Jacob. The interviews continued that evening when Detective Apodaca from the Socorro Police Department met with Brenda, whose story was consistent with the one she had given Agent DeWalt the night before. The detective's report included a few additional details provided by Brenda as well. She told him that while following the ambulance to the hospital, the suspect said to her 4 or 5 times without provocation, "I didn't touch him, I swear." Brenda said she had noticed whenever the suspect made a loud noise, Jacob would cry and clutch her, and he didn't like the suspect to hold him. On the 3 occasions the boys were left alone with the suspect, Jacob sustained injuries that were subsequently blamed on Eric. When she asked him about the injuries, he denied ever hurting the baby. She also mentioned that Eric didn't like the suspect and would glare at him, and that he didn't like being left alone with him or spend time with him. As for their relationship, Brenda told Detective Apodaca that she and the suspect got along fine except for an occasional argument about buying a trailer. Sometimes, she said, he would get upset when the baby cried at night for his bottle. She mentioned an incident in which the suspect was playing the stereo loudly while Jacob was trying to sleep, and when she turned it down a little, he had a major mood shift, becoming angry and snapping at her that the stereo was his private property and she should not touch it. Sometimes, Brenda said, the suspect accused her of acting like his ex-wife. Jacob's autopsy was conducted the day he died by pathologist Dr. Pat Lance of the New Mexico State Office of the Medical Investigator in Albuquerque, assisted by Dr. Chris Sperry. Jacob's little body was received by the pathologist in a zippered white body bag. He was unclothed, but covered in evidence of the frantic attempts to save his life, including 3 hospital tags around his ankles, various needle marks, a urinary catheter, stitches, surgical scars, a central venous access catheter or central line in his groin to allow intravenous access to his femoral vein, and more. During the autopsy, which took approximately 4 hours, Dr. Lance found Jacob's head had suffered recent trauma, in addition to the injury he suffered in March, as well as a variety of other findings indicating possible child abuse. He found abundant evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. There were no marks on Jacob's scalp and very little blood under the skin, but inside was a different matter. Dr. Lance noted the healing scar from Jacob's surgery in March, as well as a healing skull fracture. When Jacob was hit in the head in March, his skull had been fractured along a suture, which is a space between the baby's skull bones that are filled with flexible material that allows the brain to grow. Around age 2, the flexible material starts to be replaced by bone, causing the skull bones to grow together. In Jacob's case, his fracture occurred between the left parietal bone, one of the 2 large bony plates that form the central side and upper back part of the skull, and the occipital bone, which is the plate located in the lower back part of the skull. Both of Jacob's eyes showed healing retinal hemorrhages. Dr. Lance noted left parietal intraosseous hemorrhaging, which is bleeding inside the bone. When the doctor removed the skull cap, he found an acute subdural hematoma measuring 21 milliliters of blood on the surface of Jacob's brain. The doctor also found recent subarachnoid hemorrhage, or bleeding between the brain and the thin membranes that cover it. Jacob's subdural membrane was noted as healing. It would have been incised during the evacuation of his hematoma in March. Jacob had also suffered severe cerebral edema, or fluid buildup inside the skull, which had caused both cerebral hypoxia, or decreased oxygen to the brain, and microscopic hemorrhages in the medulla, indicating the brain had been compressed nearly to the point of herniation. In Dr. Lance's opinion, the recent blunt force trauma that caused Jacob's death had most likely been administered by an open hand, although he was not able to determine if it was a right or left hand. His symptoms would have started showing no more than 30 minutes after the injury. Dr. Lance noted abrasions of the skin and subcutaneous tissue in Jacob's forehead. He found slight trauma to Jacob's buttocks, although this was not visible on the skin, revealing itself only when the doctor made an incision and discovered areas of hemorrhaging in the underlying soft tissue. The largest area of hemorrhage was in the left buttock and measured 3 centimeters by 2 centimeters. The doctor discovered a healing fracture in Jacob's 5th rib and a small amount of fresh hemorrhaging around the trachea. Finally, the doctor noted acute aspiration pneumonia with pulmonary edema. It is common for the lungs to fill with fluid in patients with traumatic brain injuries. At the end of the autopsy report, Dr. Lance wrote his opinion. This 9-month-old Caucasian male child, Jacob Landin, died of a subdural hematoma, blood clot between the brain and the dural membrane, which compressed the brain and caused irreversible damage. A complete autopsy examination revealed the evidence of an old, partially healed subdural hematoma, as well as a partially healed skull fracture and a healing fracture of the right 5th rib. The microscopic characteristics of all of the healing injuries indicates an age of approximately 3 to 4 weeks. Although it cannot be determined solely on the basis of the autopsy that these injuries occurred at the same time, their similar ages suggests this. The skull fracture and the old subdural hematoma are directly related. Such injuries may be associated with an episode or episodes of child abuse. The healing phase of a subdural hematoma is particularly susceptible to rehemorrhage with trauma of a lesser degree than is usually required to cause severe head injuries, and such an acute reaccumulation of blood within the subdural space is responsible for the child's death. No other significant acute injuries were identified. The manner of death is undetermined. When the suspect left a phone message for Socorro Police Detective Pat Apodaca on Sunday, April 12, 1987, the detective returned his call immediately. The suspect told Detective Apodaca he was hurting and wanted to talk, so the detective agreed he should come in and talk. The suspect was read his Miranda rights and signed a waiver. Notes in the case file indicate the subsequent interview was recorded, although the location of the recording to this day is unknown. During his conversation with Detective Apodaca, the suspect said that when Jacob arrived at home on April 9th, he had been in good spirits and very playful. When the suspect went to change the tape after leaving Jacob on the couch, he said he heard Jacob scream and found him lying on the floor with stuff coming out of his mouth. If you remember, to Dr. McWilliams, he had described the sound he heard Jacob make as gasping noises, but said nothing about a scream. The detective told the suspect that Jacob had sustained a severe blow to the head, which the pathologist said couldn't have been caused by a fall from the couch, and believed instead that it was probably caused by an open-handed strike with severe force. The suspect continued to deny hitting Jacob. Surprisingly, when Detective Apodaca asked if he'd be willing to take a polygraph, the suspect agreed, although he said he was afraid of failing the exam, which was scheduled to take place on April 15th at 1 p.m. Apodaca called Agent Sue DeWalt of the state police to let her know about his interview with the suspect and the scheduled polygraph exam. Before the polygraph could take place, however, Detective Apodaca called Agent DeWalt on April 14th to let her know there would be no need for a polygraph because, he told her, the suspect had confessed to Socorro Police Department Assistant Chief Johnny Trujillo. Trujillo told Agent DeWalt that when he interviewed the suspect at 10:30 a.m. on April 14th, he did indeed obtain a confession. He said he was evaluating the case and had not yet made an arrest. Agent DeWalt's subsequent report documenting her conversation with Assistant Chief Trujillo on April 20th did not specify what was said in the confession or what the circumstances were surrounding it. Likewise, no police reports appear to exist that were completed and filed by Trujillo. An affidavit filed in the case in 1992 evidently used information from whatever report Trujillo had filed, but the report itself, unfortunately, is apparently lost to history. Interestingly, the aforementioned 1992 affidavit states that the suspect told Trujillo that after he put the baby on the couch with a teething biscuit, he then went back to the stereo and turned the tape over and started to record again, and this is when he heard a coughing, choke, gagging type thing. That's the fourth different description the suspect had given thus far of the sound he heard Jacob make after falling off the couch. Prior to this, he had also described it as a noise, gasping noises, and a scream. Agent DeWalt filed her 11-page police report on case number 87-23-30026 on April 21, 1987, after receiving a copy of Dr. Lance's autopsy report. She classified the incident as involuntary manslaughter. On July 9th, despite the supposed confession the Socorro police had obtained from the suspect, he underwent a polygraph exam anyway, administered by Sergeant Willie Garcia of the New Mexico Department for Public Safety, State Police Division. The polygraph had one objective, to determine whether or not the suspect struck Jacob Landin in the head on April 9, 1987, causing his death. The suspect answered no to the two relevant questions. Did you intentionally strike Jacob in the head area on April 9, 1987? And, did you intentionally strike the baby in the head area before he went limp? Sergeant Garcia wrote in his report, based on the numerical evaluation of the suspect's graph recordings, I concluded that he was not being truthful when he answered no to the relevant questions. Despite Sergeant Garcia pointing this out to him, the suspect continued denying any action on his part which contributed to the child's death. He did, however, during the extensive discussion that followed, admit to lying to investigators during his initial questioning about what happened the day of Jacob's death. He said that at the time he was questioned, he had been sedated and his mental faculties were impaired. He said he was untruthful because he was afraid Brenda would leave him if he told the truth about what he continued to insist was an accident. In the new and improved story he gave Sergeant Garcia, Jacob was standing, holding himself up by clinging to the wooden armrest of a chair in the living room. I'm having a hard time picturing exactly what the report says next, so I'll quote it directly. The suspect allegedly knelt beside him and angled his chin in a position to playfully rub his growth of beard between the child's legs. No matter how you slice it, that sounds creepy at best. Anyway, the suspect said he sensed Jacob was about to lose his balance, so he lifted his head abruptly, hoping to stop Jacob's fall. But Jacob had leaned his body over the suspect's head, so as he lifted his head, he forcefully raised the child off his feet, causing Jacob to impact heavily on the floor. The suspect also said he was certain Jacob's head hit the wooden armrest before he fell to the floor. So exactly how high did he expect them to believe he catapulted this baby into the air with the brute force of his head and neck? This is one of the weirdest explanations I've ever heard, and this is the best version of the story he was able to come up with after having 3 months to think about it? Following Jacob's fall, the suspect said, he picked up the baby and held him for about 10 minutes, during which Jacob showed no signs of being injured other than being drowsy, so he decided to put Jacob to bed. He then regurgitated his prior story about Jacob falling off the couch while he mucked around with audio cassettes, then turning around to find him on the floor convulsing with vomit leaking from his mouth and nose. He said he leaned the baby over his left forearm and patted his back in an attempt to clear Jacob's airways, and when that didn't work, he held the baby from both feet and continued patting his back. When Jacob lost consciousness, he said, he panicked and ran to the neighbor's house. The police report noted that the polygraph was sound recorded in its entirety. Now we'll skip forward a few months to December 7th, 1987, when Agent Sue DeWalt received a letter from Bruce Burwell, Deputy District Attorney of the 7th Judicial District Attorney's Office in Socorro, saying there was insufficient evidence to justify filing criminal charges in the matter of Jacob Landin's death. And that was it. The same day, Agent DeWalt marked the case status as closed. On January 9th, 1991, an attractive, dark-haired woman walked into the Socorro Police Department with a story to tell. Detective Joel Haley sat down with the former Brenda Landin, whose last name had since changed because in 1988 she had married the suspect. By this time, however, she was convinced he was not only capable of, but responsible for, causing Jacob's death. Brenda told Detective Haley that she never trusted the suspect with Jacob and thought he was a little jealous of the baby. At first, she thought Jacob's death was an accident, but over the 3 years that followed, she became positive the truth had never been told. She said she stayed close to the suspect to try to find out what really happened, going as far as to marry him and stay married for 3 years, during which time she said he was physically and verbally abusive to her. She said he was also verbally abusive to Eric, although he never hit him. As proof of physical abuse, she showed Haley a letter signed by the suspect that said at the bottom, "I will never hit you again." Their breakup, Brenda said, occurred in November of 1990 after she was informed that her then-husband had called up her 13-year-old niece, telling her she was pretty and he watched her when she was at his house. Brenda confronted the suspect, who denied calling her niece, saying he didn't remember, possibly because he was stoned. At that point, after 3 years of physical and verbal abuse, Brenda left him. After their breakup, the suspect kept calling Brenda, trying to talk to her, and bringing up Jacob's death. One day he told her he wanted to tell her the truth about Jacob's death and asked her to meet him at Jacob's grave. Instead, she suggested they meet at the police station. Near the end of November, the two met at the Socorro police station, where he made the statement that he was playing with Jacob, throwing him in the air, and missed catching him once, causing Jacob to hit the chair pretty hard. She said this was all he said about Jacob's death and that the rest of the conversation was about the two of them getting back together. You'll notice that's an entirely different version of events than any he had given up till that point. Detective Haley asked Brenda about Jacob's first head injury. She said that when it happened, the only ones home were the suspect, Eric, and Jacob, and the suspect was the one who told her that Jacob's injury was caused by Eric kicking him. She said everyone blamed Eric, who eventually admitted he had kicked Jacob, but after speaking with Eric, she didn't think he had actually kicked Jacob hard enough to injure him. Brenda's marriage to the suspect did not end in divorce. Due to the severity of the abuse, a judge granted her an annulment, along with a lifetime order of protection. She told Detective Haley that on the day of the court hearing for the restraining order, the suspect denied making a statement to her in November about tossing Jacob into the air and dropping him. At this point, changing his story is almost a career. In July of 1992, Detective Haley interviewed the suspect. Regarding the circumstances of Jacob's injury on April 9, 1987, the suspect said that he has always had a beard, and that he was playing with the decedent next to the armchair. He was laying down on the floor, and he thought that Jacob was falling, but apparently Jacob was not falling, and the defendant overreacted and went up, and I was scared because I haven't handled a kid in about 4 years. He grabbed the decedent with his left arm around the back of the thighs, and as he was getting up, the decedent hit his head, but the defendant didn't know if he had hit the chair. He was sure that the decedent hit the floor, but that the decedent didn't start crying. He was kind of dizzy. What is that now, story number 4? I've actually lost count. Detective Haley's statement continues, saying the suspect told him, "The decedent was all right after that incident. The decedent started to get sleepy, so he started to take him to his bedroom when the tape clicked, so the defendant put the decedent on the couch and gave him a teething biscuit. He then changed the tape and started recording again when he heard the decedent gargle. So the defendant turned around and saw that the decedent had fallen off the couch and stuff was coming out of his nose and mouth. He thought the decedent was coughing because he had been choking and coughing all week long. Then, according to the affidavit, the suspect essentially backed up and started over with the story of how he was playing with Jacob, saying, he thought the decedent was falling back, and as the defendant went to catch him, he went up too fast. He was on his shoulder, but he must have bounced away, and when he went to catch the decedent, he only had him by the pampers, and then his head hit the floor." Did you catch that? 2 different accounts of how Jacob was injured within one interview. Wait, he wasn't done yet. After Detective Haley had the suspect draw a diagram of the living room, the suspect pointed out the area where Jacob fell, saying, "He felt like the decedent was balancing while standing between his arm and was worried that he was going to fall, so he got up kind of hard, causing the decedent to fall backwards and hit his head." The suspect told Detective Haley it was possible Jacob had hit his head on the armchair, the floor, or when he fell off the couch, the coffee table. After Jacob fell off the couch, he said, he turned him upside down in panic and started patting him on the back, although he may have hit him harder than he meant to. He told Detective Haley the reason he left the whole armchair part out of his initial accounts of the story was because he didn't want Brenda to find out Jacob's injury occurred while he was playing with the baby, and because he didn't want to face it. He was afraid also that people might think he did something wrong because he was the only one there. At the end of Detective Haley's documentation of the interview, he wrote, "It is your affiant's belief that the defendant did commit the aforementioned crime." On August 12, 1992, an affidavit of arrest warrant for abandonment or abuse of a child was issued for the arrest of the suspect by Judge Smith of the 7th Judicial District Court in Socorro. The affidavit was prepared by Detective Lieutenant Joel Haley and approved by District Attorney Lee Deschamps. The arrest warrant was filed in Magistrate Court in Socorro the same day it was issued under docket 25-01-81-0220-A-1. 2 weeks later, on August 25, 1992, the suspect was arrested by Detective Haley as per a notation at the bottom of the arrest warrant and also documented in a criminal complaint also dated August 25th. The criminal complaint charging the suspect with abandonment or abuse of a child appeared to have been filed in Magistrate Court under the same docket number as the arrest warrant, and the filing of the complaint was approved again by District Attorney Lee Deschamps. Detective Haley documented his arrest of the suspect and his subsequent recorded interview, which took place at the Socorro Police Station at about 1:53 p.m. on August 25, 1992. After the suspect was advised of his rights and signed a waiver thereof, he said he originally told investigators that Jacob fell off the couch because he was sick and taking medication. However, he said what really happened was that Jacob leaned on his neck while the suspect was lying on the floor, and he thought Jacob was losing his balance, so he grabbed Jacob's leg, thinking Jacob was going to fall to the right. He fell to the left instead. The suspect tried to move fast enough to prevent the fall, but Jacob fell anyway and hit the armchair. When he picked Jacob up, his eyes were white and he wasn't moving, but the baby appeared to try to catch his breath. When Jacob didn't respond to his voice, the suspect said he ran with the baby to a neighbor's house, where a black woman came out and gave Jacob mouth-to-mouth while he panicked, went blank, and just stood there doing nothing. Someone called an ambulance, he said, and he thought he then went to get Brenda. Detective Haley asked why the suspect told investigators the original story about Jacob falling off the couch. The suspect said he feared Brenda's father, who had threatened to shoot him, and he said Detective Apodaca threatened him too, saying he would make the suspect pay. He said when he had difficulty dealing with the whole situation, he was put on Xanax to keep him calm. He said he was very confused and thought if he said he was playing with Jacob, he would be accused of throwing him. He also said he didn't think Brenda would marry him if she knew what really happened, which he feared would make her think he was a worthless father. Detective Haley asked about Jacob's previous head injury. The suspect said Brenda's mother had told him Eric had kicked the baby. That's interesting considering every other account of that incident places the suspect home alone with the boys when the injury occurred. As for his failure on the polygraph exam, the suspect said he was messed up and out of it during the polygraph due to mental stress and that he didn't know day from night at that time due to grief and being freaked out. He said the same thing happened after his divorce from Brenda. He didn't know how to handle either situation. After the divorce, he had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for a day and a half. About the 2 questions he failed, the suspect said the polygrapher told him the machine wasn't working properly, which of course isn't documented anywhere. He said when he took the exam he was so out of it that he thought he was back in the hospital when he was a child. He said he had taken some allergy medication before the test and doesn't remember being asked any questions. He also said District Attorney Lee Deschamps, who happened to be Brenda's lawyer during her divorce from Jacob Landin, had told Brenda the polygraph machine was broken. Man, this guy used all the excuses, didn't he?
Oh man, I can't. I'm not feeling so well. I got a ton of work to do here. MSG allergy, peanut allergy. I just ate there last night.
Wow, thanks for taking all the excuses, dude.
Doctor appointment, car trouble, plantar warts. Granddad fought in World War II. He's your head man.
In what looks like an attempt to fake human empathy, the suspect told Detective Haley he was very attached to Jacob, who he used to call Jake the Snake, and that Jacob used to come to him for comfort when he was crying, which made the suspect feel good. That directly conflicts with Brenda's previous accounts of the way Jacob acted around him. When the detective asked why he and Brenda broke up, the suspect said he was accused of calling Brenda's 13-year-old niece and asking her out, but he doesn't think he did this, although he used to drink and smoke a lot of weed. He said on the day in question he had smoked weed laced with cocaine and didn't remember calling anyone. On the day Jacob was fatally injured, the suspect said he could have injured Jacob while hitting him on the back when he choked on his teething cookie because he panicked. One of the strikes could have hit the baby in the head. When asked, he said it was possible he had been drinking that day because at the time he generally consumed at least 2 shots a day. After Detective Haley apparently filed the criminal complaint against the suspect in Jacob's death, the suspect spent 1 night in jail and then the case apparently fell off the face of the earth for the next 13 years. On Thursday, April 14, 2005, Sergeant Thomas E. Christian Sr. of the New Mexico State Police Criminal Investigations Section, the supervisor of the Cold Case Homicide Unit in Albuquerque, received an email from his lieutenant instructing him to research a case file numbered 87-23-3-0026, which was the case number noted on Agent Sue DeWalt's original police report, and to reach out to Ms. Brenda Crawford in the near future to advise her of his involvement in the new investigation. Since her divorce from the suspect, Brenda had reverted to her maiden name. Sergeant Christian's lieutenant had received an email from Brenda stating, "My 9-month-old son was beaten to death on 04/07/1987. I have done everything in my power to seek justice in this case, from speaking directly to the last 2 DAs, contacting victims' rights, but so far nothing has been done. The name of the victim was Jacob Landin. Case number 87-23-3-0026. Investigating Officer Sue DeWalt." Brenda then provided the suspect's full name, date of birth, and social security number before continuing, "I am the mother of the victim, Brenda Crawford. The reason Juanita Gordon, who is an investigator with the 7th Judicial District Attorney's Office in Socorro, New Mexico, gave me for not prosecuting is because she could not give the suspect a speedy trial, and she also mentioned that she was afraid the suspect might sue the county. This is a cop-out since the suspect failed the lie detector test and confessed to 2 different officers. To me, this is not a lack of evidence. Socorro County Police are negligent. They do not care that this person has never been punished and probably is still hurting innocent children. I did not have this information until 1990, but the DA's office did. Yet they did not do their job. Thank you, Brenda." The same day, Sergeant Christian opened an investigative inquiry, new case number 05-23-3-0077, to find out what happened to the original case. On April 21, 2005, he reached out to Brenda, letting her know he was looking into her son's case. On April 26th, Sergeant Christian met with investigator Juanita Gordon with the District Attorney's Office in Socorro, New Mexico, who remembered the investigation. She also remembered the polygraph being administered, but to her knowledge, no criminal charges were ever filed. As investigator Gordon recalled it, Brenda's initial statement provided the suspect with an alibi. She said that 2 years after Jacob's death, only when Brenda and the suspect broke up, did Brenda contact her and change her mind and her story, wanting criminal charges filed for beating Jacob to death. Investigator Gordon said that then District Attorney Lee Deschamps would not consider filing criminal prosecution due to the inconsistencies in Brenda's statements, which is not what Brenda said she was told as the reason for charges not being filed. Also, I have to interject here. As for Brenda providing the suspect with an alibi or her story changing, not a single one of her statements even came close to providing an alibi. She was at work when Jacob's injury occurred. All she said when asked by police at the time was that she didn't think the suspect was capable of hurting Jacob. That is not an alibi. Also, it's very easily conceivable that her opinion about whether or not the suspect could have been responsible for Jacob's death would change after 3 years of being subjected to his mental and physical abuse. Sergeant Christian set about gathering any and all documentation he could on the original case. He obtained a copy of the original state police report filed by Agent Sue DeWalt, as well as a copy of the Socorro Police Department reports on the investigation. However, only the first page of Officer William McNeil's initial report was included in the case file. The rest of the report has never been recovered. He received from the Office of the Medical Examiner in Albuquerque a package that included the 14-page autopsy report, 5 pages of log sheets, a 2-page death report, copies of evidence forms, a body receiving and delivery record, toxicology report and serologist report, and a CD containing 37 post-mortem photos of Jacob. In May of 2005, Sergeant Christian tried to obtain information from the magistrate court on the arrest warrant from 1992, the affidavit for arrest warrant, and the criminal complaint, which were all filed under the same docket number 25-01-81-0220-A-1. However, he was told that, in accordance with state law, the court is only required to maintain records for 5 years, so those documents would have been disposed of sometime after August of 1997, 5 years after they were filed. He checked with the district court clerk's office to see if any of the documents were bound over from magistrate court and filed there. There was nothing. He then checked with the district attorney's office, asking if they had any records or files on this investigation, trying to find out what happened with it. Investigator Juanita Gordon and Deputy District Attorney Bruce Burwell said they only maintained records for about 10 years, so they had no record of the case or the suspect's 1992 arrest. Sergeant Christian spoke with David Bangs, evidence custodian of the New Mexico State Police Evidence Vault in Santa Fe, who told him no evidence was being maintained there relating to this investigation. Finally, Sergeant Christian spoke with former detective, then Chief Joel Haley of the Socorro Police Department, who said he could not recall what happened with the criminal charge that was filed against the suspect. He said if he found any documents that refreshed his memory, or if he remembered what happened, he would call Sergeant Christian back. The sergeant noted bleakly in his report, "This concluded my contact with Chief Haley." Sergeant Christian's investigative conclusion reads as follows. After an extensive review of the completed investigative reports, which included the autopsy reports, it is my opinion that the criminal charge of abandonment or abuse of a child, which resulted in the death of Jacob Landin, a first-degree felony in 1987, was justified and should have been pursued against the suspect. The suspect was arrested in 1992 and charged with that offense, but after his arrest, it appears that nothing else occurred after the initial filing of the criminal charge, and I have been unable to determine why this had occurred, as records no longer exist. There was sufficient evidence in this investigator's opinion to prove that the suspect knew of Jacob's recent head injury, which occurred several weeks before this incident, and this incident which then resulted in Jacob's death. The suspect should have been more attentive to Jacob's needs due to Jacob's recent head injury. The suspect did negligently and without justifiable cause place Jacob in a situation that endangered his life. The suspect knew of Jacob's prior injury, and combined with the fact that he changed his story or version of events during the investigation, which were not witnessed by anyone else, several times, that fact alone draws a lot of suspicion to any story he tells after his initial statement. This incident, which resulted in Jacob's death, occurred one way, not the 2 or 3 ways as told by the suspect. The suspect knew that he needed to be much more attentive to Jacob's needs, as Jacob was only 9 months old and still in need of almost constant supervision, and the recent head injury, and the suspect failed to do this. The problem with his investigation at this time is the statute of limitations, and in this investigator's opinion, if this is not overcome, there cannot be a successful criminal prosecution in this matter. We also have a speedy trial issue. The suspect was arrested in 1992, and it appears that the criminal charge was never pursued by the state. On October 6, 2005, at the State Police Office in Socorro, Sergeant Christian met with Brenda Crawford to tell her that his review was complete, and he would be submitting his case file to the District Attorney's Office. 13 full months later, on November 7, 2006, Sergeant Christian received a fax from Chief Deputy District Attorney Bruce Burwell saying he had reviewed the material Sergeant Christian sent him about the death of Jacob Jeremiah Landin several times. For the second time in 19 years, Bruce Burwell claimed there was insufficient evidence to proceed with a felony prosecution. He was of the opinion that the extreme age of the matter, coupled with the statute of limitations, which was in effect at the time of Jacob Landin's death, would make it impossible to proceed with a prosecution in this case. At that point, Sergeant Christian noted, "This case is now considered closed." Just to give Sergeant Christian his due respect here, he was exceptionally thorough in his review of the original investigation and in obtaining all surviving documents from the original case, but he was stymied at every turn by missing documentation, incomplete reports, lost recordings, and especially a district attorney's office that was, in my opinion, more concerned about its win-loss record than obtaining justice for the brutal and unnecessary death of a child. On next week's episode, you'll hear my recent conversation with Jacob's brother, Eric Carter-Landin, who continues to fight for justice for the baby brother he adored. With Jacob's case in the forefront of his mind, he launched his own true crime podcast, True Consequences, 1 year ago, focusing on unsolved and unresolved cases from New Mexico. On his website, he said his goal is to effect change and leverage public awareness to help drive some of these cases from cold to solved. Eric has devoted 4 full episodes to Jacob's case, and I'll include links to those episodes in the show notes because they are essential listening. I highly recommend all 4 of them, but if you only have time for one, I would suggest you start with the episode in which Eric sat down with his mom, Brenda, for their first ever real conversation about Jacob and his case. It's a heartbreaking interview that was clearly difficult for both of them to get through, but it's full of first-hand information that only those closest to the case could know. Also in the show notes, I will link to a petition Eric created seeking justice for his baby brother. Jacob Jeremiah Landin's voice was taken from him at only 9 months old, before he even learned to talk, and he continues to be silenced 33 years after his death. We need to speak for him now, and to ensure his voice is heard. That's it for this week, guys. Tune in next week for episode 36, Jacob Landin, Part 2. If you like the show, please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform, and please subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlecHildren.pod@gmail.com. You can also subscribe on YouTube by searching Suffer the Little Children Podcast. Visit the website at www.sufferthelittlecHildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes and become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter at STLCpod. View photos related to today's case on Facebook and Instagram. Read more about today's case and many others at sufferthelittlecHildrenblog.com. This podcast was written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dreamnote Music. Other music and sound effects for the show were created using sounds from audiojungle.net. Hug your babies a bit closer tonight. Until next week, bye guys.